Good morning. Happy Monday at COP26. It's a pleasure to see everybody here in the audience. And hello to everybody who's joining us online. Just a quick introduction. My name is Kristina Skierka. I'm the founder and CEO of Power for All. And we are here today to talk about jobs. So we'll start off with a bit of context setting on a new report, version 2 that we're working on of our Powering Jobs Census with some of our partners up here on the stage with us. And then we'll get into a facilitated discussion. So instead of PowerPoints, which I'm sure you all have seen enough of, we're going to just simply be talking as humans about this very important topic. And the great news is that pretty much everybody up here and their organizations have recently released reports that are highly relevant to the discussion at hand. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? So a little bit about our 2019 census, which is what really today's event is founded on and what the 2021 event will also be looking at, but with an expanded emphasis on new countries. So the reason we wanted to talk about powering jobs at this event is that the world obviously has been turned upside down for the last 18 months, and jobs and job losses are part of that. And I think it's really important to note some of these statistics that you'll see on the screen, which essentially what we've heard to date is that because of the pandemic, around 100 million people have been pushed back into poverty. That's extremely concerning, obviously, after all the advancements made in this sector. And in GOGLA's recent discussions and report, we also learned that about 23 million people missed out on the opportunity to have their first connections to energy. And importantly, job losses were highest for women, and that doesn't matter which country you were in. I can't even think of one country where there weren't reports of women losing jobs because of choices, difficult choices families had to make about who was going to stay home and take care of family and home responsibilities. So despite South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa not having the largest contagion rates, the job losses and income losses were among the highest in the world. In Kenya, 62% of employed workers lost their jobs during the pandemic, and over 90% of households have reported income losses. So that's incredibly concerning, very significant, and again, this was disproportionately concentrated with women. So what we want to do, though, after recognizing those facts, is also look at what's possible. So some great news did come out of the last 18 months, which is the resilience of the decentralized renewable energy sector. We'll talk a little bit about some very early insights we have. We won't provide any statistics or specific numbers because we're in the very early stages of data collection, but there is some good news to be had. So I guess what I would say is it's important to know that the renewable energy sector overall grew over the course of the pandemic. In fact, the most recent numbers from IRENA tell us that about 12 million people around the world are employed in renewable energy. And in addition, even though our sector is still what we would call burgeoning, the decentralized renewable energy sector, referring to everything from rooftop solar to mini grids to highly efficient appliances for weak grid environments, we are in a situation where there is some reason to be optimistic. And I think one of the things we also want to be talking about today is the types of jobs that are available through the decentralized renewable energy sector. And those tend to be more inclusive, and they tend to be more equitable. So when we say inclusive, we certainly mean diversity in age, gender, types of jobs, but we also want to talk a little bit about the equitability, and that refers really to wages. And the median wages in the sector, based on our survey from 2019, are higher than the median wages in the rest of economies. So I think it's worth spending a few minutes talking about what's special about the decentralized renewable energy sector. And we'll hear all sorts of opinions about that from our panel. But importantly, just in renewables themselves, women actually are a bigger part of the workforce. So in the traditional, more sort of fossil fuel part of the equation, you generally see about maybe 25% of the workforce as female. But in the renewable energy sector, it's closer to 1/3. Now, we still can do better, and we'd certainly like to see those numbers up at 50%. But due to the nature of the business of decentralized renewables, which really is focused on local practices like demand stimulation and the proximity to the end user, DRE has a really strong local presence. And there's such a unique ability of this sector to work with customers and help raise their energy use, bring them up that proverbial energy ladder that we often talk about. So I guess what I want to say just before we get into facilitated discussion and a few previews from our job census that we're conducting this year is that we have to remember that this is a solvable problem with existing technology, energy poverty. So there's just under 1 billion people today that have absolutely no access to energy and about another 1 billion with intermittent access. And that's all highly solvable in an affordable, effective, and fast way with decentralized renewable energy. So talking about the additional benefits of the kind of jobs that are available has been, I think, a winning formula for a lot of people on this panel. You know, as we've met more governments and continue to work with local ecosystems, the question always comes back, what are the development outcomes? And so being able to have the kind of jobs numbers that all of our organizations are working on, absolutely critical to help telling that story and make sure we start mainstreaming decentralized renewable energy deeper and farther into the ecosystem and get energy to people faster. So then just a few quick notes. Again, these are very early insights, and we hope that you'll continue to follow the development of the Powering Jobs Census. But moving forward, you see that job growth, over the past year seems to be on the upswing. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. But also the predictions, based on what we've seen so far from a very limited number of responses, is that jobs are likely to increase to pre-pandemic levels in next year. So that's very exciting, and at least we're maintaining the male-female ratio, but we also hope with some various programs that we know are going on and some work we'll be doing that we'll start to see more women involved in this space, and particularly young women, as I hope Meredith will be talking to us about. So with that overview, I'd like to go ahead and just get into our facilitated discussion, and I'm going to kick things off by throwing things over to my good friend Joseph Nganga from Rockefeller Foundation, or now the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. So as we know, Rockefeller Foundation with partners at Catalyst Off-Grid Advisors recently published a really interesting model of what is possible by pursuing agendas like we're talking about at COP26 with jobs. So Joseph, do you want to tell us a little bit about those findings?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Kristina, and the powerful team for arranging this interesting discussion, and the panelists who are a lot more knowledgeable than I am, so it's very good to be here. So first, the Rockefeller Foundation, the IKEA Foundation, and the Bezos Earth Fund have come together to form what we're calling the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which has a host of other institutions, including DFIs, MDBs, and so on, as members of the alliance. And the idea is to leverage the 1.5 billion with another 10 billion in additional capital to drive the sector. Among our ambitions, besides 4 billion tons of CO2 and connections to 1 billion people who either don't have access today or have intermittent access, we're also targeting 150 million jobs. And so this discussion and this panel is core to what the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is all about. So the study with Catalyst Energy Advisors is particularly instrumental in providing a baseline on which we can say, if we get everything right, this is where we could be. And it points to millions of jobs, 25 million of jobs in the direct energy access space, but hundreds of millions of jobs in addition to the adjacent sectors. So if you provide power to people, what could they do with it? In agriculture, in manufacturing, in education. So it's a host of direct jobs, but an even larger potential for indirect jobs. But to get there, there's an obvious point, which is large-scale adoption of DRE. Without DRE, these jobs will not happen because energy is a critical part to driving these new jobs. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to elaborate, but that's the overview of how we think about the Global Energy Alliance, our role in driving jobs, and some of the key highlights from the job study.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much. And by all means, please do send in your questions through the live link. And we'll be collecting questions both from the audience here as well as remotely. So we'll get through some initial facilitated discussion and then be into questions and further discussion. So thank you so much for that, Joseph. And next, I'd love to hear from Koen Peters, who's the Executive Director of GOGLA, somebody who I've known for, I think, a decade now. But your team just released the semi-annual Global Off-Grid Solar Market Report, and I believe this looked at July to December. Is that right? The right dates?
No, it looked at the first half of 2021.
First half of the 2021. Thank you so much. And a lot of us were obviously waiting impatiently. Every 6 months I wait for this and can't wait to see what your numbers are. So it'd be great if you could tell a little bit about the methodology of that report and really what you saw in terms of how the sector's faring so far.
Yeah, thank you very much. And like Joseph, it's fantastic that you organize this session with a focus on jobs, which I think is really key. Maybe just a word about what we are looking at. GOGLA is the industry association for off-grid solar, and off-grid solar means solar lanterns, solar home systems, the appliances that come with it, and standalone productive use appliances. So the sales report that you referred to also covers those technologies. And we do this every half year. We collect sales data from about 100 different companies that sell these kind of products. And well, what we see is the glass half full, half empty, a little bit on how you look at it. COVID has definitely taken a hit on our market significantly. We saw that very much in the sales numbers from a year ago, the first half of 2020. But then we saw in the second half of 2021 that numbers started to bounce back. What we've seen in the report from the last half year is that they stabilized at that bounce back level. Yeah. So we are at numbers that are more or less the same level from before COVID, a little bit below, but not a lot. And that might be good news, but at the same time it's also bad news because the industry was on a growth trajectory before, and we've not been able to see that growth in the last 3 half-yearly reports. And that, of course, that's the 23 million people that you mentioned that we have not been able to achieve by not realizing that growth. I should say that the picture is varying a lot per region and per market segment. We see East Africa stable, West Africa continuing to grow healthily, Southeast Asia numbers declining, and that's definitely concerning. We see cash sales declining or stagnant. We see pay-as-you-go continuing to grow healthily. Yeah. We've been looking in the past at how that's connected with jobs in 2 angles. First, by the number of jobs that's been generated directly in our industry, sales jobs, servicing jobs, marketing jobs, all those kind of jobs. That was a report from 2018 that concluded around 370,000 jobs had already been generated in our industry until 2018. As you mentioned, about 1/3 women. But we've also been looking, and a report on that came out last year, on how those products, those solar home systems in particular, how they result in income generation for the end users. And what we found, particularly in East Africa, that about a third, 34% of the users use their solar home system to generate extra income, either by being able to work more and more efficient hours, or by really creating new business opportunities, and on average making about $46 a month extra on that. And the typical number that we saw is that for every 100 systems, around 20 full-time equivalent work positions were created, and that was 50-50 men, women, and 50-50 rural and not rural. So, stopping there, but the big picture. A resilient industry that's continuing to deliver strong and important impacts, but not growing nearly as fast as we would like it to grow.
So thanks for that. I'm just going to ask you a quick follow-up question, because again, one of the things that we want to see to really have a healthy energy access ecosystem is jobs closer to the people that are served by these products and services. So when you're referring back to sort of the health of the sector, those, first of all, in a time and an era when over 18 months entire businesses crashed, I think it's an incredible show of resilience of the sector to say at least we're where we were before. So even though we want to see it potentially, half empty, I think that's actually a cause for real respect for what this sector is able to do. But are you seeing those results that you referred to about sort of stabilization or maybe even a tiny bit of growth? Is that largely in the big international companies, or is that also in sort of more local companies that are based, say, in Nigeria, in Sierra Leone, et cetera?
Well, the large international companies wouldn't exist without the small distributors. They are absolutely part of their ecosystem, and they need them to reach far and deep and get close towards those households.
Yeah.
So there's no separation that one could be successful without the other.
Yeah.
Having said that, we have better information, better visibility of the larger companies who find it easier to share data, and we find it easier to reach them.
Yeah.
They also find it easier to reach out to their investors, and what we've seen is that their investors have all dipped into their pockets to make sure that these companies have been able to sail through the COVID. They have also grouped together to set up relief funds. It's taken longer than what was hoped during the early months of 2020 to materialize that. We're really happy that that is there. So there's now relief funding available to see the industry through the COVID. By and large, we haven't seen a large number of companies failing, but I also should say that the smaller companies, the local distributors, they will fail quietly, and we wouldn't know that.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not a guarantee that this applies to the entire industry, and I think a lot of companies have had a very, very hard time and are still having a hard time.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's been untouched by this. Thank you for your comments. And now it's time to hear from Dr. Arunabha Ghosh from the Council on Energy, Water, and the Environment. And I do want to refer back to when we partnered on our job survey back in 2019, and there were some great findings that were revealed. And before COVID, we found that, or we predicted that over 190,000 direct formal jobs and over 210,000 indirect ones would be in India by 2023. So how far do you think we are from those numbers at this point? Or how would you see in your country the COVID setback?
Sure. Many thanks, Kristina, and good morning to everyone. Thanks for having me on this panel. First of all, let's recognize, where we were at that time when Power for All and CEEW did that survey. We already were looking at about 95,000 direct jobs that were there in the DRE sector, and about 190,000 odd that we could get to. Now, what happened was, there was certainly post-COVID, there was a massive dip in power demand. But what was interesting is by July 2020, right, we were not even out of the first wave, overall power demand in India was back up to the previous year's levels. So it was kind of defying where the economy was versus where the energy sector was going. In part, that's probably because we were all locked in and keeping the lights on. But it also demonstrated that it's, energy is something that it's like air, right? You can't do without it, regardless of whether activities have stopped. There's something else constantly going on. So that increase in power demand has continued apace since then. In fact, this year, in 2021, our latest estimates are that power demand is significantly higher than what was last year. Now, where does DRE then fit in this story? Now, of course, there has been a slowdown in the pace at which these companies were being able to deploy. But at the same time, as we were just discussing, the fact that the sector is still around means something. The Clean Energy Access Network, which is the other organization that we had co-created, has continued to see membership growing.
Yeah.
So that means there are more DRE companies that are joining the sector. And I would argue, and on this I don't have data yet because we have to run those numbers, but I would argue that with the massive surge of people having gone back to rural areas, having lost their jobs in urban areas and factories, etc., that is actually going to be a source of additional employment in rural areas for distributed energy, but also affiliated activities, new types of on and off farm employment, new types of value-added services that you start, food processing, milk chilling. We can talk about the livelihoods dimension, but I see this as a major driver of new jobs in the rural areas.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and just to, I think maybe some of our global audience might not be familiar with the distinction between jobs and livelihoods and why there's a slight nuance there. Do you mind just describing why you focus on livelihoods and what that means to CEEW?
Absolutely. I mean, we believe that the energy transition has to be brought closer to people, and it should deliver on a changed sort of capabilities for the households to be able to drive their own economic destiny. That's not going to happen only by handing out a solar lantern, right? That's important, but it's not enough. It's also not going to happen only by subsidizing a connection to a wire, whether it's from the large grid or from a mini grid.
Right.
Because ultimately the household has to be willing to pay for that energy use on a regular basis, whether it's every month or every quarter. And a household at the bottom of the pyramid is not going to do that unless it is able to see a rise in its incomes. And that's why at CEEW we've been pushing very hard on using energy access as a driver to power livelihoods. And last year we launched a major program called Powering Livelihoods. We are investing in 6 startups, everything from solar-driven hydroponics for green fodder to silk reeling to food processing, milk chilling. And these are entities that have crossed the tech valley of death. Their products make sense, but they have not crossed the commercial valley of death. So can we take a company that has maybe 700,000 rupees of sales to 7 million rupees of sales, right? So $1 million of sales. When you get to that threshold, then you begin to attract commercial capital. You begin to get easy access to bank credit. So it's that commercial value of death we are trying to cross. Now that then generates, I mean, our estimation is this alone is a 500,000 number of jobs that can be created just on livelihood activities over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. I just want to say one more thing, if I may. You know, we recently released a report called Powering Livelihoods Globally. And we scanned about 36 different energy access related initiatives across the world. And okay, I'll carry on. So the unfortunate thing was only 3 out of those 36 initiatives that we analyzed had livelihoods as their focus.
Yeah.
Now this is unfortunate because the 770 million people who still need access to energy over the course of the next 9 years will not be able to sustain their livelihoods on the back of a pandemic recovery unless we are able to focus on livelihoods. And I would warmly welcome an initiative like the Global Energy Access for People and Planet if we could have a dedicated vertical on livelihoods through that new initiative. This large amount of capital that's coming in from Rockefeller, from Bezos Earth Fund, and from IKEA. If we can begin to channel that to drive livelihoods, that would really transform the model for energy access in this decade going forward.
Thanks for that. And now I want to turn to Meredith Adler, the Executive Director of Student Energy. And, you know, this is a very heartening discussion to hear about the jobs potential. And in fact, I believe, you know, there's numbers out there that say, you know, the DRE sector alone could be responsible for 4.5 million jobs in literally just a few years. And I guess I want to turn that back to you and ask, how do we find the people to fill those jobs? Because one of the potential challenges for us, right, is that we build this sector, we see the market develop, but what if there's a gap in the talent pipeline? We need the human capital to help achieve universal energy access. And there's a whole range of skills and training that fits into that. So I'd love to hear from you and where you sit as the head of student energy. And what do you see from young people globally being interested in this sector? What do we do to build that talent pipeline?
Yeah, so at Student Energy, we work with over 50,000 youth in 120 plus countries, and so we talk about this quite a bit. And I actually think that the framing of the question is maybe a bit challenging, and that for young people right now, they hear a lot from their politicians, from governments, from various philanthropic groups about all of these jobs, but for them, the reality is not manifesting. And what you actually have is young people globally, we know this, are very interested in climate. You have climate strikes literally everywhere, or especially where it's appropriate. But also you have other kind of challenges, and what we're seeing is actually that 74% of young people who have attended a climate event don't actually know what the next steps are that they can take to be engaged in energy or be engaged in climate change. And so I think for that, there's a big call, especially for governments, but for others as well, to start to clarify these pathways. So even the term DRE, distributed renewable energy, I doubt half the people in our network would understand that acronym. And those are just really minor things, but I think where we have a big responsibility is to start to carve really replicable and scalable pathways for young people to get into this. When you talk to most young people, even in North America and Europe, where they have a lot more privilege, if they have a job in renewable energy or in clean energy, they networked their way into it. And networking your way into a job is a huge problem if you think about power and privilege, because being able to network means that you could get a badge to come to COP, that somebody would fund you to be here, and then you can go chat with one of these gentlemen about hiring them at your organization. And I'm sure they would be really receptive once you're here. But if you can't kind of systematize clear pathways to jobs, that can be a big challenge. The other challenge, I think, also is relying just on formal university educational systems. Unfortunately, they are not adapting fast enough, and they're also not offering practical deployment skills. So Student Energy really focuses on how do you teach deployment skills? How do you get people through a project from start to finish so that they know how to kind of put together all of the pieces? And uniquely, it's a very universally trainable skill set. Young people are really good at taking this is a strategic plan, this is a business plan, communications, fundraising, et cetera, and adapting that to their cultural context, and it's something that you can really scale. So that's something we're really excited about. And I think the final thing I'll say, or two things potentially, is just this last Thursday, we launched the highlights of our Global Youth Energy Outlook, which engaged 42,000 youth in a survey and 150 dialogues globally on what is it that young people want from the energy transition in terms of climate change and how do they want to be part of it. And it was a really exciting survey in that most young people actually feel very hopeful that there will be an opportunity for them in this sector. But then once again, that kind of confusion was coming in. But what's important for governments and businesses is that 83% of young people globally said they would vote for a politician based on sustainable energy policy. So there's a huge opportunity to harness that momentum and really play the long game and future-proof what we're talking about so that we're not here again 10 years from now saying, oh, good news, we have more funding, we're going to do more job training programs, but that we actually are growing up a generation to work in this, and especially for young women. I think our network is over 50% women. And it's not something we see here at COP. It's not what you see here on stage, but there's an incredible opportunity to grow up that generation to be, an equal percentage of what you see going forward. But it is something that we stand to lose. It's not something that we can really take for granted, because if they are not supported in unique ways, we know what will happen. They will drop off as they go forward in their careers or in their lives. And have to make different choices if they're not supported in those career paths from a really early stage.
So let me dig into something that you said, because I just want to take advantage of this moment to get really clear. What would a repeatable pathway look like? So do you think some industries are getting it right? Like, who's doing a great job of basically having a feeder system into their industry? And how can our sector replicate that?
Funny enough, I think one of the best examples of how this has been done is actually the petroleum industry in the United States. They started, and this is true in other countries as well, and we see it all the time. We see young people who want an opportunity in energy and go to work in the oil and gas sector because there is a clear pathway for how you get in, and they would rather be in and learning that skill set than not have the opportunity at all. And this is where I think clean energy is really missing out. I mean, in the United States, people show up at your high school and tell you about what a great career path you can have. Then they're at your university and they help to form a club so that you can make friends and have friends in the sector already. And then you have very specific training programs with internships that go forward. So, I mean, it's not rocket science, but they basically have kind of like looked at the whole value chain of their employees and made sure that they can reach them every step of the way and keep encouraging them to become part of the industry. And that is something, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. That is something Student Energy is working on, that full pipeline, but we can use more partners in making sure that more young people feel like this industry is welcome to them, because right now it's, climate, environment, this can be very elitist and exclusive, especially to Indigenous youth and other youth who face other barriers. And so there's a huge opportunity to open the door and say, yeah, we want you to be part of this with us.
So it almost sounds like you're recommending, I mean, what in my mind is coming back when I was young, many years ago, was like career days at colleges where, you would always see the consulting firms and then you'd see the oil industry and so on and so forth. So it's almost like partnerships with universities, but also with TVET institutions. Is that right? So that we're like getting in those early days.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could go on about this for the whole panel, so feel free to stop me. But, there's great psychological research about what happens if you can accomplish something before you're 25. So, and basically at 25, your brain shifts and you become a much more kind of solidified on your pathway, if you will. But if you can have a positive experience with something before you're 25, you're very likely to believe in it for the rest of your life. And so there's a huge opportunity, yes, through career days and things like that to harness that momentum. But I think going beyond that, if you look at a project and practicum-focused educational experience, and it doesn't have to be with universities, I actually think that sometimes the bureaucracy of universities is really slowing down this whole process. But if you look at a really practical educational experience in experiential education, and you can get someone through a successful project, and it doesn't have to be huge. It could be like throwing a panel discussion. It could be some of these things that we seem to find as very minor. And help them with managing money, give them $5,000, $10,000 to get their first project off the ground and experience that success. It really goes so far to creating a generation of young entrepreneurs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Arunabha?
No, I just want to come in on what Meredith was saying with an example.
Yeah.
Right? A couple of years ago, I delivered a lecture at the Indian Institute of Technology in Chennai. Those IITs are the sort of elite engineering schools. Now, around Chennai in southern India, we have a big automobile manufacturing hub. So most of those students end up in sort of mechanical engineering courses because then you get recruited. So as I finished the lecture, these students came up to me and said, we joined 4 years ago, 4-year engineering school, and we joined as mechanical engineers. And already within 4 years, as we are approaching the job market, those companies don't want us. They want only computer science engineers because an electric vehicle is basically an iPad on wheels, right? So the point is the market is moving so fast, right, that even during the course of a single undergraduate education, you realize that your main offtake industry is changing. Now, fast forward 2 years. Just 2 weeks ago, I delivered a convocation lecture to another university which trains only computer science people, right? And what have they done? This goes back to what Meredith was saying, that positive experience. These are students learning about computers. They have nothing to do with energy or climate, etc. But they have basically started developing their campus into a low-carbon facility. The campus is in a very water-distressed part of Rajasthan, so they are harnessing the water. They've basically grown a forest on this kind of mountain that they were. And if you look at the 10-year before-after photograph, it's like barren versus lush. And this is all being driven by the students. So I completely endorse what Meredith was saying, that you need to provide those channels by which students can feel that they have the agency to kind of make that change. And it's and literally, between now and next COP, we're going to have 10 more examples to share like this.
Thanks so much, and I love this idea of spending a few minutes adding color to this discussion. So on that, Joseph, I want to turn to you because you have an amazing new job. And I don't think you followed any sort of traditional pathway to get here, but I do remember in your resume that spending time at Acumen was part of it. So can you talk about how you got to where you are, just for the students listening to kind of understand how to start navigating into this sector?
Absolutely, and I was very happy to hear that as long as you're under 25, you're still malleable, because I'm still under 25, at least mentally.
It's just
Just an average.
Oh, it's an okay. So my path has been very interesting in that I followed what I find fascinating. And what I find fascinating that has the ability to also make a difference in the world has meant that you have to be open, you have to listen. You've noticed on this panel I've spent more time listening than talking, because oftentimes people know more than you do. So I think to get to here, first it's about understanding what are the global issues, and then understanding what are your personal strengths, and how can you use your personal strengths to be part of the solution to the global issues. And so the long and short of it is climate, energy are a key part of what will be required for Africa to develop. And so in the last 10, 15 years, I've invested in understanding, learning, investing, taking a risk. And I have to say that there have been a lot of wonderful institutions along the way. You mentioned Acumen, but there's a whole host of other organizations that are willing to support young Africans or young people through this process. And so my strong encouragement is to identify global issues, identify your strengths and how you can be part of the solution, and then connect with people who are doing good work in the space.
Thank you. That's great to hear. So we do have some questions coming in. I do have a few more topics I want to raise with the panel before we get to those, and we'll also turn to the audience for any questions as well. But I know we have some folks on the stage who've been working on compacts, one of the great initiatives for SE for All, and part of the high-level dialogue on energy process is setting up these compacts, and commitments are something that we hear a lot about at a week or 2 weeks like this at COP. So, Koen, we are signatories and big supporters of your Powering Billion Lives Compact. And I would love to hear from you a little bit about the kind of efforts you think we need to focus on, along with your members and the industry organizations around us, to really support not just the kind of talent pipeline that we're talking about, but what can be done to actually help these companies thrive and create more job opportunities.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great question, and really glad that you've been joining us on the compact. There's around 128 signatories at the moment.
Excellent.
I think that signed up. If you've been following GOGLA on Twitter, you've been seeing a great number, really great number of great quotes from all sorts of supporters on why it's so important to support our compact. And our compact is saying that if we all work together, industry, governments, investors, development partners, if we're all aligned to work towards the same goals, we should be able to reach 1 billion people and provide them with energy access by 2030. And 1 billion for us is broken down in, we've listed 550 million people that get first-time access at Tier 1 or Tier 2 level, around 260 million people that have grid connection or connection but need backup power, and around 190, 200 million people that should get more productive use. There's been a lot of conversation here around livelihoods and how energy should help to generate income and jobs. And for us, that's an important driver on why we work. It's really a big impact. Listening to that, I also realized we should be cautious that it doesn't get turned around, that it shouldn't become a requirement for people to make use of energy in a productive way for them to get access to energy. There's 790 million people that are lighting their homes with kerosene lanterns and torches and candles. Dr. Matour from International Solar Alliance called that criminal neglect. I can only echo that, and I'm wondering how we would call it if in 2030 that's still the case. So there's also a climate agenda, a climate justice agenda on why we need to make sure that everybody has access and can use that to improve their livelihoods, but it shouldn't be a requirement for them to be able to improve their livelihood. Having said that, we are definitely working on making the technology offering better and wider and more affordable. We want to work with governments and development partners around thinking on subsidy schemes and other concessional financing that make it easier for customers to afford these products. And the real story is we need to work together. As Joseph says, there's so many people that know other things better than we do. We need to make use of all those capacities and direct it in the same way. It sounds very fluffy, but in the end, that's what we need, more partnerships.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. So before we turn to some questions coming in digitally, is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question? We have a microphone. Here's one here. And please identify yourself, your organization, and then go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, good morning.
Hi.
I'm Martin from Argentina for Renewable Energies Argentine Chamber.
Buen dia. Mucho gusto.
Gracias. I want to ask, which are the principal barriers that you have found to develop small companies, and how about the financial needs to develop small companies? Because big companies have other opportunities, but to develop more work, how about the small companies?
Great, thank you. Who would like to take that question?
I can
please go ahead.
take a stab. Right. I think this is a great question because when we say startup, it sounds cool. Where talk to a startup entrepreneur, it's not
cool.
fun, right? So the number one challenge that I see is the fact that the entrepreneur is everything. The entrepreneur is the technology developer. The entrepreneur is the chief marketing officer, is the CTO, the CFO, the chief salesperson, right? So it becomes really, really challenging where you're trying to improve your product and your offering for the market while you're also trying to get the revenue to be able to invest back. And this becomes really restrictive, and many companies sort of drop off when they're unable to do that. So one of the things we're doing through that Powering Livelihoods initiative is actually helping these startups kind of divide up that labor in a way where we can support them either on the tech development side or on the market access side, etc. That's number one. The second is the access to credit is absolutely challenging because you don't have large enough balance sheets to have an inventory of the things that you need to even make your product, right? So access to very quick and small doses of working capital is essential. But because large companies can do off-balance sheet financing, right, and small companies can't, this is the perverseness of the way the financing industry works, where those that have large balance sheets can do off-balance sheet, and those that don't have to find collateral. So how do you get to giving access to that small doses of working capital to keep them going? And the final challenge, I would argue, is the need to constantly innovate your business model in a very rapidly growing sector. Because let's take, when I wrote the business plan for the Clean Energy Access Network to create a platform for enterprises in this space, at that time in 2012-13, we counted about 200 odd companies in that space. We now have more than 1,000 companies in the DRE space in India. But those whose business plan was solar lanterns now suddenly saw 9 years later that India has gone and extended the grid to 97.6% of the households. So that can't be your main offering. But your offering in terms of, okay, I can be a last mile service delivery person. I can help collect bills. I can provide a resilience infrastructure for the larger grid through my mini grid, etc. That's a very different approach, right? So the simple point is that takes me back to the challenge that the entrepreneur faces. If you fixate yourself on just one product, then it's very difficult to innovate. Finally, of course, there is the policy ecosystem. I'm really excited that on the back of our Powering Livelihoods initiative, the Government of India already now has a draft policy for using distributed renewables to drive livelihoods. It's the first of its kind policy in the world. It's sitting with Cabinet, waiting for clearance. But I think that can really create the policy platform to attract a lot more startups, a lot more innovators wanting to enter this space.
Thank you. Go ahead, Meredith.
And what we also see from a youth perspective is the first-in funder. And it's not necessarily $1 million. It's often between $5,000 and $25,000. And then especially if you don't have a family with means or what have you, that can be really challenging. Like, so we've spent the last 12 years training young people on everything we know. I was the first student energy staff person. Now we have 40 staff people, so I've been through this journey. And that first piece of validation is often so hard to come by, even if the person is very dynamic, adaptable, and that type of thing. And so actually our Energy Compact is about reducing that first barrier and doing that pre-acceleration, because so many of the innovation and accelerator programs are actually at a threshold that is above where you can get to if you don't already come from some layer of a privileged ecosystem to begin with. So.
Thanks, Meredith. Joseph has to leave us in just a few minutes. We're going to go a little bit long in the panel since we started just a little bit late. So I've got one question here. We've actually got tons of questions. I'm just having to filter. So great topic, says one of our virtual audience. How do we make the DRE job sector more equal? We see jobs have been created in Africa, but many locals are not in senior or executive positions. It's more internationally owned companies who get the funding, which creates bias and makes it unequal. This is an excellent topic. Do you mind fielding that?
I'm happy to take it, and it's at the core of the Alliance. We strongly believe that in order for the sector to be sustainable, local knowledge, local entrepreneurs, local participation is critical. In addition to local participation, women participation is critical. So for example, we've set a goal that among all the beneficiaries across our work, our target is 50% women, whether it's the end user of the product, electricity, the entrepreneur, the employee, and we have programs across all those to try and make sure we have that gender balance. Mm-hmm. It's very challenging as a local business, and I should know, as a local entrepreneur having built a company in the energy space, it's very challenging to raise money. And there's a variety of reasons. The nascency of the sector, the fact that you're looking for small capital. Believe it or not, small capital is challenging for investors to come into because they have transaction costs. The identification and definition of the market opportunity. In a nascent sector where you're proving that there's an actual market for a product, it's your word against everybody else. And I'm very happy to see that credible institutions such as Sustainable Energy for All, GOGLA and others are producing independent reports. But if I were to say it as a local entrepreneur, it would be my word against a lot of other statistics. So having credible market information helps investors understand it. Back to the local entrepreneurs, I think all of us globally have to make a conscious effort to spend more time, make an effort to connect with the local businesses, local entrepreneurs, and do so in a very systematic way. If you approach it in the natural way, the default will be an international organization that already has all the books of accounts in order, already has a credible portfolio of investors, is already significantly de-risked, so you're basing your assessment on other people's work. If you are to invest in local businesses, you have to take that one level lower. You have to work with local accounting firms for due diligence. You have to work with local firms for technical assistance and so on. And it's a more expensive way of doing it in the beginning, but it allows for a very sustainable sector. I was both disappointed but also hopeful when I had you mention that while you can see how the international organizations are performing post-COVID, there's a sector of distributors that we don't have enough information on because they're too small, they're too local. We know they're hurting, but we're not able to deliver the kind of support we're able to deliver to the larger international organizations. And that to me is almost a crime, because those local businesses are the ones that are going to carry this forward. When the pandemic hit, international organizations evacuated their people. Who remained behind? The local entrepreneurs. So we have to consciously make an effort to support them. It will not be easy. It's not the cheapest way to do it. It doesn't give you a quick ticket size, because investors always want a substantial ticket size. But if you do it over time, it will create a long-term sustainable future.
Thanks, Joseph. And I know you have to leave, so feel free to exit. And we'll just continue for another few panels. But thanks for questions. But we'll continue. So thank you so much. Is there another question from anyone in the audience personally? Yeah, please, right over there. Please identify yourself, your organization, and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Miriam from Sustainable Energy for All. So we're always talking about the technical side of clean energy jobs, but I'm from comms, but I consider myself consider myself in the clean energy sector. So what are the ways that we can actually get the other sectors into this conversation? For example, if I want to be sustainability communications specialist, is that something that you see yourself in the future? To be included in the ecosystem, as we always mention.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, no, so I like that question. I'll take a shot at it and then hear from others on the panel. And I'm carrying the flag over this week for female founders, really. So I think, for young people, whenever I get asked a question like this, my answer is think about your own personal brand, right? And what is it that you want to be known for, and build a resume around that. Without a doubt, especially with some of the agreements coming out of these 2 weeks here, the demand for sustainable communications experts going to be going through the roof. So you're in luck. But I do think it's important to kind of follow some of what Joseph was saying about his career path. Figure out what is your topic that you want to solve, and figure out your best application of your unique gifts and skills, your genius, I like to call it. But I think you're going to be in a fine position. Does anybody else want to respond to that question?
I just want to say that, last week when India announced its 2070 net zero target, all the modeling, etc., is work that my organization CEEW had done. But on the back of that announcement, we've personally given more than 100 media briefings, right? And to Kristina's point, this is just going to now explode, because it changes everything. It changes not the energy sector, it changes how you move, how you eat, how you grow things, how you make clothes. So pretty much there is going to be a need for communicating sustainability in a way that it shifts from the margin to the mainstream of the public consciousness. And if we can have literally thousands of people kind of speaking in that one voice, but of different in different tones, it would really help. So, it's just going to grow.
Thank you.
Communications is the thing that ends up in my inbox the most. People saying, do you have a young person who's good at communications who could come work for me? So there you go.
Excellent. Okay, just a quick, let me just pick another question here from what's coming in. This is an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about this, but from Sonal, Adler, forgive me for butchering your name. Major job portals do not recognize DRE as a sector, and even for those who have worked in this sector find it difficult to get a job. What do you think can be done to introduce DRE as a mainstream sector to improve job visibility? That's an interesting topic. Anybody want to try that?
CRE or DRE?
DRE.
Oh, DRE.
Yeah, Decentralized Renewables.
So, we've actually worked with LinkedIn on this, and the fact that, even LinkedIn has struggled to find the right nomenclature to describe how, what are the jobs in the renewable energy sector. And I think it speaks to much of what you were saying earlier, is that the sector is changing so fast that the main thing you can learn is how to learn.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a big data and evidence gap exactly on what are the titles, and back to the idea of systematization. Like, we're not going to be able to scale a sector and scale the jobs until we can really systematize how you're training and doing that en masse as well. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Meredith. And I would just say sort of watch this space. As we move forward with our Powering Jobs survey that we'll be publishing in chapters as we go, we are going to be working with an organization called Shortlist. And Shortlist is a pretty well-known recruiting firm in the sector. And our hope is to do some benchmarking on surveys and titles and actually, I think, shed some light on some of those gray areas that make it hard to really figure out your pathway in and through.
Yeah.
So, any other questions from the audience?
Can I
please.
just
go.
add a comment to this question and to the question from the lady? Branding is important. Branding for the off-grid solar, the distributed renewable energy sector is important. It's why we're here at COP26, an important part of why we're here, why you are here, why am I here. I think we're all here, and why we organize these sessions in this fantastic SE for All pavilion. To beat on that drum that energy access is a key part of the climate agenda, of climate justice, the climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and we need to tell that story, and we need to make sure that everybody who's here working on climate, but if we step out of this conference, who's working on agriculture, on fintech, on data, on health, on education, that they hear about the solutions that we can offer. So I think there's indeed plenty of opportunity for people in a communications role, that think about communication in terms of branding and strategic positioning, to think along and help us, the spokesperson, to do that in a very important, in a structural and well thought through way.
Yeah, no, it's great that you say that too. And if I could just build a little bit on your comment, I think one of the most important things we need to do as a sector going forward is really work with those adjacent SDGs. So whether it's ag or health or gender, and start showing and communicating to the topic at hand how effective decentralized renewables are in achieving those other SDG outcomes. And that's certainly a path we're headed on. I know many others are as well, but really, really critical as we move forward, again, in the spirit of growing the jobs and the talent base. So we've got time for one more question from either the audience or online, and then I've got a final question for all panelists. Any questions in the audience at all? No? Okay, let's go back to this last one. Let me just pick one more. This person didn't identify themselves, but the question is there a framework or a scalable pathway where DRE jobs have been sustained and individuals receiving training have an assured, well-paid job? I think there probably are a lot of examples of that. It sounds that this person is from Bangladesh. They've seen the sector decline. And what skills are being developed and how relevant are the skills to other jobs? So sort of, do we have proof that people have long-term, well-paid jobs? I think you're looking at some of them. But beyond that, what skills are being developed and how sort of transferable are those skills? I just, again, at a real top level, these are all transferable skills, whether it's communications, et cetera. I mean, project development, like if you're on the engineering side, again, organizing a mini grid, it's a very different piece of work than working with a grid, but a lot of the same principles in engineering apply. So what would you say?
Yeah, can I say something to that? Because we looked at this a few years ago. There's a lot to be said about, by the way, about the DRE industry in Bangladesh, but it was very specific for Bangladesh. So I don't want to answer in this panel. We're open to respond to that offline. But we've been looking at what kind of jobs are being developed in our space, and then you see that about 50-60% are in sales roles. Depending on the business model, 2% for cash and 7% for paygo are in after sales and servicing, and a mix around 15-16 technical installers and the rest in management and other roles. These on the whole, these are good quality jobs that we generate. It's not very uneducated or low-paid jobs. The industry is really delivering quality jobs that are well paid in the industry. Yeah. Also because we need talent and we need good people. Yeah. And most of them are young. I am definitely above average in my industry in terms of age.
Oh, you're young at heart, though, Koen.
I feel with Joseph on that.
Yeah. Well, then just a final round of questions for everybody on the panel. And this is a little bit about advocacy and what work we need to do as we move forward with the Powering Jobs campaign, because advocacy is part of the work. We don't create reports just to create reports. We create reports for action. So, if I could just get maybe one or two top-line answers from each of you, what do you think we can do to get more jobs in the countries that we work in? And who needs to do what? Is there a role for governments? Is it businesses? Maybe just give me your top two ideas about what are the actions to get more jobs going in this sector.
Well, as I mentioned, we all need to work together and create new partnerships. And if I think about where I think the biggest need is for at the moment for more public funding and more public engagement, public sector engagement in our industry. We need to strengthen particularly those partnerships, more end user subsidies, more funding to leverage private sector investment, but also governments that are clear about the electrification plans and how they see the role of distributed renewables in the future.
Thanks for that. Arunabha?
I think more than creating jobs, we have to create enterprises, and allow for enterprises then to kind of create that job demand. And for that, making sure that these startups that need to service a rapidly growing sector have access to that capital, have access to the ability to plug into other networks, etc. So you create a sort of ecosystem of startups in the energy access and distributed energy space. And when you start breaking down the entire value chain, you realize that distributed energy will not be just for the home. It will be for, health centers. We've just announced a policy in India for solarization of the primary health center, something that Power for All and CEEW have pushed for before. It's in the productive use sector. It's in electric vehicle charging. It's in sustainable cooling. That alone is another 2 million jobs opportunity. It's so when you break it down, you see that it's no longer energy jobs are going to be in an oil and gas kind of field or a thermal power plant. It's by definition a future that is increasingly decentralized, increasingly digitized, and increasingly decarbonized. So just enable the startups and the enterprises to prosper, the jobs will come.
Thank you. Meredith?
Couldn't agree more with both of these panelists, but I would also say really think about the engagement of young people. Often we hear about climate protests and Greta that like, oh, this is so inspiring, young people are going to get this, but ultimately they can't do it alone. It takes intergenerational partnerships. It takes those enterprises reaching out and training young staff. It takes governments really thinking about who do they design programs with and for. And so I'm a big advocate for intergenerational partnerships on this and thinking about how do we really leverage that, because so many of these countries that face either high carbon intensity or low energy access or both, the average age is something close to 25 years old. And so if you're not thinking about how are you designing for young people, you are really missing a huge amount of the population that can be a big part of this driving force.
Thank you for that. Well, that's going to wrap up this panel, and I hope some of what you take away from today's discussion is it's not all bad news. In fact, there's some real positive stories that we're going to be hearing about resilience in this sector, job opportunities, and equitable energy access. So thank you for joining. You can always go to powerforall.org and sign up for our newsletter, stay on track to see what happens with our Powering Jobs Census. And I want to thank my fabulous panelists, all partners of Power for All, and go forth and find a job in our sector. We need you. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.